1950s in America was a time of economic prosperity, social conformity, and traditional family values. For children growing up in this era, daily life was shaped by these broader societal trends, as well as by the technological advancements and cultural norms specific to the decade. As we explore a typical day in the life of a 1950s American child, we'll uncover not just the routines and activities that define their experiences, but also the underlying social, cultural, and economic factors that influence their world. The day for a typical 1950s child often began early, around 7 a.m. Unlike in later decades, it was common for children to be woken by their mothers, who were often stay-at-home parents. This reflected the prevalent family structure of the time, with clearly defined gender roles that saw fathers as breadwinners and mothers as homemakers. The consistency of this morning routine provided a sense of stability and predictability for many children. Breakfast in the 1950s was considered the most important meal of the day, and children were rarely allowed to skip it. Popular breakfast foods included eggs, bacon, toast, and increasingly packaged cereals. The rise of sugary cereals marketed directly to children was a new phenomenon in the 1950s, reflecting the growing influence of television advertising on family consumption habits. This shift in breakfast trends would have long-lasting effects on American dietary patterns. After breakfast, children would prepare for school. Unlike in previous decades, most children in the 1950s had access to indoor plumbing, making morning routines more convenient. However, expectations for personal grooming were often quite strict, especially for girls who were expected to have neatly combed hair and clean dresses. Boys typically wore collared shirts and slacks, reflecting the more formal dress standards of the era. The journey to school in the 1950s varied depending on location. In suburban areas, which were rapidly expanding during this period, many children walked to neighborhood schools. This independence in commuting reflected the perceived safety of suburban communities. In urban or rural areas, children might take buses or, less commonly, be driven by a parent. The growth of suburbs and the increasing prevalence of family cars were reshaping the American landscape and, consequently, children's daily experiences. School in the 1950s was markedly different from both earlier and later eras. Classrooms were often more crowded due to the post-war baby boom, with student-teacher ratios much higher than today's standards. Discipline was generally stricter, with corporal punishment still common in many schools. This approach to education reflected broader societal values that emphasized respect for authority and conformity to rules. The curriculum in 1950 schools focused heavily on basics like reading, writing, and arithmetic. There was also a strong emphasis on civics and American history, often taught with a distinctly patriotic slant. This focus on patriotism and American exceptionalism was partly a response to Cold War tensions, as schools were seen as crucial in shaping future citizens who would uphold American values against the perceived threat of communism. Physical education was a significant part of the school day for many 1950s children. There was a national emphasis on physical fitness, partly inspired by concerns that American children were becoming soft compared to their Soviet counterparts. PE classes often included calisthenics, team sports, and in some schools, activities like square dancing. This focus on physical fitness reflected both health concerns and cultural anxieties of the Cold War era. Lunchtime in 1950s schools was often a simple affair. Many children brought packed lunches from home, typically sandwiches, fruit, and perhaps a homemade dessert. School cafeterias were becoming more common, especially in larger schools, offering basic, hearty meals. The National School Lunch Program, established in 1946, was expanding during this decade, reflecting growing awareness of the importance of nutrition in child development. Recess was an important part of the school day, providing children with unstructured time for play and socialization. Popular playground activities included jump rope, hopscotch, and games like tag or Red Rover. These games, which required little equipment and encouraged group participation, fostered social skills and physical activity. The emphasis on outdoor play reflected the era's less sedentary lifestyle compared to later decades. After school, many children in the 1950s participated in organized activities. Boys might join Boy Scouts or sports teams, while girls could participate in Girl Scouts or take dance or music lessons. These gendered activities reflected and reinforced societal expectations about appropriate interests and future roles for boys and girls. The growing popularity of such organized activities was part of a broader trend towards more structured childhoods. For children who didn't have after-school activities, the hours after school were often spent in unstructured play. In suburban neighborhoods, it was common for children to play outdoors with friends until dinner time. This freedom to roam and play unsupervised contrasts sharply with later decades and reflects the era's different approach to child safety and independence. Television began to play an increasingly important role in children's after-school routines during the 1950s. As TV ownership became more widespread, children's programming expanded. Shows like Howdy Doody and The Mickey Mouse Club became cultural touchstones for many children. However, TV viewing was often limited by parents, reflecting concerns about this new medium's influence on children. Homework was typically lighter in the 1950s compared to later decades, but it was still an important part of many children's evenings. Parents, especially mothers, often supervised homework time, reflecting the era's emphasis on parental involvement in education. The kitchen table was a common spot for homework, placing this activity at the heart of family life. Dinner time in 1950s households was usually a family affair, with everyone gathering at the table at a set time. This routine reflected and reinforced the era's strong emphasis on family unity. Meals were typically home-cooked by mothers, often featuring meat, potatoes, and vegetables. The regularity and formality of family dinners contrasts with the more flexible eating patterns of later decades. After dinner, family activities were common. This might include listening to radio programs, watching limited television, or engaging in hobbies or games together. Board games like Monopoly or card games were popular family pastimes. These shared activities reinforced family bonds and provided a sense of togetherness that was highly valued in 1950s American culture. Bedtime for children in the 1950s was generally earlier than in later decades. A typical bedtime routine might include a bath, brushing teeth, and perhaps a bedtime story. The emphasis on routine and early bedtimes reflected the era's more structured approach to child rearing, as well as the earlier start times for school and work. Religious activities often played a significant role in children's lives in 1950s America. Many families attended church services on Sundays, and children might participate in Sunday school or youth groups. This religious involvement reflected the decade's high levels of religious participation and the central role of faith in many families' lives. Saturdays in the 1950s were often filled with a mix of chores and leisure activities. Children might be expected to help with household tasks like cleaning or yard work, instilling a sense of responsibility and contribution to family life. These expectations reflected the era's emphasis on work ethic and family cooperation. Weekend leisure activities for children often centered around outdoor play. Bike riding, roller skating, and pickup games of baseball or football were common. These activities reflected the decade's more active, outdoor-oriented childhood experiences, contrasting with the more sedentary, indoor-focused leisure of later eras. Movie matinees were a popular weekend treat for many children in the 1950s. Genres like westerns, science fiction, and animated features were particularly popular among young audiences. These shared cultural experiences often became topics of conversation and play among children, shaping their imaginations and social interactions. Public libraries played an important role in many children's lives during the 1950s. Saturday visits to the library were common, with children selecting books for both pleasure reading and school assignments. This emphasis on reading reflected the era's strong focus on literacy and education as paths to success. Family outings were a common feature of 1950s childhood. These might include picnics, visits to local parks, or drives in the family car. The increasing availability of automobiles and the expansion of the highway system were making such outings more accessible to many families, changing the nature of family leisure time. The concept of allowance became more widespread in the 1950s, with many children receiving a small amount of money weekly for completing chores. This practice was seen as a way to teach financial responsibility and the value of work. The allowance system reflected the decade's prosperity and the desire to prepare children for future economic roles. Hobbies were an important part of many children's lives in the 1950s. Boys might collect model trains or build model airplanes, while girls might engage in crafts like knitting or embroidery. These gendered hobbies reflected and reinforced societal expectations about appropriate interests for boys and girls. Music played a significant role in 1950s youth culture, with the rise of rock and roll having a particular impact. While many parents were wary of this new musical form, it became an important part of teenage identity. For younger children, exposure to rock and roll through older siblings began to influence their musical tastes and cultural awareness. Patriotism was a strong theme in 1950s childhood. Schools often began the day with the Pledge of Allegiance, and symbols of American identity were prominent in many aspects of children's lives. This emphasis on national pride was partly a response to Cold War tensions, aiming to instill strong patriotic values in the younger generation. Health and safety concerns in the 1950s were different from those of later decades. While there was increasing awareness of issues like polio with widespread vaccination campaigns, many safety measures common today were absent. Children often rode bikes without helmets and cars lacked seatbelts. This reflected a different approach to risk and safety in child rearing. The threat of nuclear war was a background presence in many children's lives during the 1950s. School drills teaching children to duck and cover in case of nuclear attack were common. While many children may not have fully understood the implications, these drills contributed to a sense of underlying anxiety that was characteristic of the Cold War era. Racial segregation was still a reality for many children in 1950s America, particularly in the South. The experiences of white and black children often differed significantly, with segregated schools, neighborhoods, and public spaces. This separation had profound effects on children's social experiences and understanding of their society. The role of fathers in children's daily lives was typically more limited than in later decades. While fathers were often seen as the ultimate authority in the family, their direct involvement in child rearing was generally less than mothers. Weekend activities with dad, like fishing trips or watching sports, were often highly anticipated events for children. Neighborhood life was a crucial part of childhood in the 1950s. Children often formed close bonds with others on their street or block, creating a sense of community that extended beyond the family unit. This neighborhood-centric childhood reflected the era's emphasis on community and the perceived safety of residential areas. Comic books were a popular form of entertainment for children in the 1950s. Superheroes, war stories, and horror comics were particularly popular, though the latter faced increasing scrutiny and censorship as the decade progressed. Comic books often served as a form of escapism and a way for children to explore complex themes in an accessible format. The concept of teenager as a distinct phase of life became more prominent in the 1950s. While our focus is on younger children, the emergence of teen culture had ripple effects on younger siblings, influencing fashion, music tastes, and behaviors. Many children looked up to teenage siblings or characters in media, aspiring to emulate their perceived maturity and independence. Vacation time for 1950s families often meant road trips or visits to relatives. The expanding highway system and increasing car ownership made family travel more accessible. These trips exposed children to different parts of the country and became important shared family experiences. Gender roles were strongly enforced in many aspects of 1950s childhood. Girls were often encouraged to play with dolls and engage in domestic activities, preparing them for expected future roles as wives and mothers. Boys were typically steered towards more active outdoor pursuits and games that emphasized competition and physical skill. School performances and events were important occasions in many children's lives. Participation in school plays, choir concerts, or talent shows was common. These events not only showcased children's abilities but also strengthened the connection between school and family life, with parents often deeply involved in supporting these activities. The space race, which began in the late 1950s, captured the imagination of many children. Interest in science and technology increased, with many children dreaming of becoming astronauts. This fascination with space reflected the era's optimism about technological progress and America's place in the world. Attitudes towards discipline in the 1950s were generally stricter than in later decades. Corporal punishment was still common both at home and in schools. The phrase, "wait until your father gets home," was often used as a disciplinary threat. This approach to discipline reflected broader societal values, emphasizing obedience and respect for authority. Despite the many scheduled activities, boredom was not uncommon for children in the 1950s. Without the constant stimulation of digital devices available to later generations, children often had to rely on their imagination and creativity to entertain themselves. This may have fostered greater independence and problem-solving skills. As we reflect on childhood in 1950s America, we see a world that in many ways differs markedly from contemporary experiences. The emphasis on structure, family unity, and clearly defined social roles provided a sense of stability and predictability for many children. At the same time, this era was not without its challenges and limitations, particularly in terms of racial equality and gender expectations. The daily life of a 1950s child was shaped by the unique confluence of post-war prosperity, Cold War tensions, technological advancements, and traditional social values that characterized the decade. The legacy of 1950s childhood continues to influence American culture and nostalgia. While it's important not to romanticize this era, understanding the experiences of children during this time provides valuable insights into the evolution of American society. From family dynamics and educational approaches to leisure activities and social expectations, the childhood experiences of the 1950s laid the groundwork for both continuity and change in subsequent decades. As we look back on this period, we gain a deeper appreciation for how childhood experiences reflect and shape the broader currents of history, reminding us of the complex interplay between individual lives and societal change.